Hi, welcome to the sixth lecture devoted to testing hypotheses. And this video is devoted to some very basic and fundamental issues related to this procedure. So let us start with the definition and some explanation. First of all, you define statistical hypothesis as a statement about the numerical value of a population parameter. For instance, you can test whether men are taller than women. You can test whether students with grade point average above 5.0 are more successful in their careers compared to students with grade point average below 5.0, and so on and so forth. Here, the crucial thing is to define the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. So we assume null hypothesis to be true unless data provide the opposite evidence. Typically, zero hypothesis represents some kind of status quo situation. And H1 is the alternative hypothesis. It typically represents the value of the population parameter the researcher aims to support. For instance, so imagine that as a researcher, you want to investigate whether women have the same salaries as men, provided they have the same education and experience. Probably you have some prior idea about this issue, and this is fine. For instance, when you test this research hypothesis for Polish workers, you can refer to statistical data from other countries where women typically have lower salaries, and so on and so forth. So you might be willing to hypothesize that, in fact, Polish women have lower salaries than Polish men. However, zero hypothesis always represents some kind of status quo. So you will state that the difference between wages of male and female workers is equal to zero. And the alternative hypothesis is something you accept only if you manage to reject zero hypothesis. So your alternative hypothesis will state that the difference between salaries of male and female workers is greater than zero. Again, even though you are primarily interested in the alternative hypothesis, zero hypothesis should represent some kind of status quo. So if you manage to reject it in favor for the alternative hypothesis, you will indeed state that Polish male workers have higher salaries than Polish female workers. Test statistic. So test statistic is a sample statistic computed from information provided by the sample that is used by the researcher to decide between the null and alternative hypothesis. Again, appropriate test statistic will depend on the size of sample, the nature of your data, and so on and so forth. But I promise we will get back to this issue. Another thing related to testing the null hypothesis is type 1 and type 2 errors. So put it like this. Based on the results of your test statistic, you can either accept the null hypothesis or you can reject it. However, there is no guarantee that you manage to describe the state of nature correctly. So, if you reject the null hypothesis while it is true, then it is about type 1 error, and typically we describe probability associated with this error as alpha. Or you can accept the null hypothesis while the alternative hypothesis is true. So then, of course, we are dealing with type to error, and probability associated with it is typically described as beta. So perhaps it's quite intuitive. However, I would like to underline that zero and alternative hypothesis have to be mutually exclusive. So they cannot be correct at the very same time. This is the kind of the idea. If you reject the null hypothesis, then the alternative hypothesis is inevitably true. Okay. However, even if you do not reject zero hypothesis based on your test statistic, you cannot really accept the null hypothesis because probability associated with type 2 error is typically unknown. So if you reject zero hypothesis, then you reject H0 and accept H1. However, if you do not manage to do this, you have to say that you failed to reject the null hypothesis, or you have insufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis, but you cannot really accept the null hypothesis. Okay, so when it comes to the very generic procedure of testing hypothesis, the stages are like this. First of all, you have to select and outline assumptions about research sample. For instance, you have to know whether it's indeed representative, whether data is distributed normally, for instance. You have to know the size of your sample. Then, based on your research objectives, you identify the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. You have to identify the rejection region. So this is something related to the level of confidence, and we will get back to this in the next video. You have to select the appropriate test statistic, calculate test statistic, and finally, based on this, you have to make a conclusion whether evidence is sufficient to reject the null hypothesis or not. Oh yeah, by the way, here I mentioned zero hypothesis, but just for your information, it's more conventional to say the null hypothesis. Okay, so actually that's it when it comes to introduction to the topic. Hope it was clear and see you in the next video.